Hi, I'm Seamless, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Uncanny Valley. You've probably heard this term before, but if you don't know what it means, the Uncanny Valley is what happens when you get close to very realistic versions of something, but not close enough. Because if you have a range of realism, so over here you have not very realistic, the cartoonish even. This is typically used to describe visual media, art, or movies. Very cartoonish. Things are designed not to look realistic and not in trying at all to be realistic. It's just an artistic vision of something. And then you have realism. This is real, right? Real stuff. As you get closer to realism, you can have realistic elements in cartoonish elements, and it won't be uncanny and it won't make you feel uncomfortable. But then there's this range of right before realism to almost right before that. This little area that is just close enough to realism, but not all the way to make it very clear that it is perfectly real. This is something that you can attribute to something like what we would think of as bad CG in a movie, like the infamous Rubber Neo in Matrix Reloaded, that kind of thing, um, or what I actually think is really good CG, but still kind of uncanny, was the young Jeff Bridges as the character Clue in Tron. That was very much. I mean, that might have actually been a very like specific design on their part with the idea that it was a CG character, like in a CG world, but it's still just weird looking. Like it's just like it's everything. All the features and the descriptions of something that should be real are there, but they don't work in ways that make it fully real. And you might be thinking, why the hell am I talking about this in the context of CG and art and whatever? What does this have to do with what I typically do with, which is music? And that's because this kind of stuff does exist in music as well. Most typically, most typically, this sort of line is displayed and quite obvious when we start talking about realistic instruments. Like before I got a guitar, I spent years and years trying to synthesize guitars or use fake guitar plugins like FL Slayer. The description of the FL Slayer plugin, and as far as how we hear it, you think to yourself, yeah, this makes sense as far as this sounds like a distorted electric guitar, but it doesn't, like when you hear it, it doesn't have enough of the qualities of a real played electric guitar for it to make sense as a guitar, and it just comes across as being, it's not even super fake. It's just like unrealistically realistic, and this makes us feel uncomfortable when we hear it. It's just kind of like this weird, just sort of feeling you get. That's a description of the Uncanny Valley. And the reason I'm bringing this up though is that this is actually a bit of a counterpoint to my usual rhetoric of saying that if it sounds good, it is good. And for the most part, that's still true. But the Uncanny Valley exists not just when it comes to realism, but when it comes to approaching goals. What I mean by that is that if you're a new producer and you're starting out, you're saying, okay, I want to make music. What do I want to do? I want to say, I want to sound like Calvin Harris or whatever, right? So then you make a track that has all the various descriptions of a Calvin Harris track. It's got the progression, it's got the instrumentation, has like the lead synth. Maybe your voice even sounds like Calvin Harris. But you put it all together and it doesn't read like a Calvin Harris track. Now, to you, it's going to sound disappointing and weird because you know what the goal is. But if somebody else is just kind of like, oh, that sounds kind of like Calvin Harris, but not. That's usually enough for them to go be like, ah, that's cool. It's the whole other thing. But you're just like, ah, it doesn't quite get the itch of the Calvin Harris thing. And that's one particular aspect of it. Another aspect of it is basically has the idea about trying to learn fundamentals of things. Stuff like music theory or best practices for mixing. All that stuff I used to harp on, and I kind of still do harp on. The idea of like, the minus 6 dB thing, and the not cutting below 6, not cutting more than minus 4 dB, and never boosting any EQ, that kind of thing. That's that kind of stuff that exists to alleviate the Uncanny Valley. What I mean by that is that in the era where these rules mattered the most, if you didn't do that in a song, it would sound different to people. They wouldn't know why. They wouldn't have a good understanding. I mean, regular music listeners haven't the slightest idea about any of the stuff that we're talking about when it comes to music production, and that's all fine and good. But they can still pick up on like the differences to things. Humans are very good at being able to compare stuff to other stuff and seeing patterns and identifying differences and stuff like that. That's something that our brains are super good at. And even if we don't understand how something was made, we can definitely tell that it is different in some way or another. And all of those best practices exist, even if you don't understand them, even if you have no idea why they exist to ensure that that doesn't happen. That people who are used to music are hearing the color, the flavor, the presentation, and even the genre balance and the arrangement styles, all the stuff that they're used to hearing, so that when they listen to it, it doesn't rub them the wrong way for reasons that they don't know why. Because even if you're not a CG expert, you can look at bad rubber Neo and go, there's something wrong with that. And you might not know it's because the subsurface scattering on the clothing was too uniform. You might not know that the animation looked super janky and didn't, wasn't really realistic enough with like how a person would actually do that. You wouldn't know that the cloth structure was just too rigid, and that the simulation wasn't good enough for it to actually, pass as realistic. That stuff, you wouldn't know why it looked weird, but you just know that it does. So as much as, and this is really about when you're trying to sound like something else. And for the most part, you're trying to sound like the general average of what music sounds like. And also, for as much of that, you don't need to like, you are your own perfect barometer for that kind of stuff. Because like I said in the video where I said if it sounds good, it is good. The idea of it sounding good is if it sounds good to you. And what you think sounds good is 100% a product of what you've heard and listened to throughout your life. It's built up your life's understanding of what good music is. And whenever you make anything that you make, you're always going to be comparing it to that. That is your level of what things sound good. And that's going to be different for everybody. So it's actually kind of not a good plan unless you're very specifically trying to copy a very particular like artist style or something, to like try and generalize it as much as possible, because it's just, at the end of the day, there are not enough markets to generalize that. Like, there are not enough demographics of people who all feel the same way about a particular kind of music. And then innovation would just never happen. It did anyway. So don't really. But I'm introducing this idea of the Uncanny Valley just in case you do, and in case you're wondering why. This is something that exists not just for the visual quantities, which is something that people usually compare it to. It doesn't exist just for the comparison of realism versus not. It's mostly the idea of a goal, and almost that goal, but not quite that goal. And there's not really a solution to this. It's not really a problem either. This is kind of just something that I want to put in your head so that you can sort of think about it and apply that to whatever it is you might be doing. Because really, any kind of artistic endeavor, anything that has a kind of aesthetic of any kind at all, is going to have this quality that you can apply to it. And of course, if you're a producer of that medium, then you are in a better position to understand the differences and see maybe why or why not that happens. Particular example is this whole analog business I started doing, where if I were to try, like, if I wanted to mimic like a particular old school sound design with perfect digital stuff, and then there'd be like this weird difference between like the perfect filter, the perfect tone, the perfect everything about the digital stuff versus the very not perfect, all of that exact same stuff with the analog stuff, because it's really the same process. It's, you make a saw wave, you have a filter, you have an envelope, and that's the sound. You do that with the digital stuff, and even though that's the exact description of what that sound was, there's differences. And those differences you have to make up. You have to approach it in different ways to make it, shore up those differences. And until you do, you get the uncanny valley of that's a little too perfect. And that's what that is. If you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.